The moment that bullet left the barrel, 2 police officers unknowingly declared war on the United States Army. Rain hammered the deserted highway outside Ashford, Virginia, turning the black pavement into a trembling mirror of red and blue light. Colonel Adrian Cole stood beside his vehicle with both hands raised, his white shirt soaked against his skin, while Officer Ryan Mercer aimed a service pistol directly at his chest. 3 hours earlier, those same hands had held a soldier's heart together. Now they were being treated like weapons. "Get on your knees," Mercer shouted. Adrian remained still. Not defiant. Not afraid. Controlled. The discipline in his posture had been forged through 20 years of military service, through field hospitals filled with smoke, blood, and men calling for mothers they would never see again. He knew panic could kill faster than any bullet. He also knew the 2 officers in front of him had already decided what kind of man he was. They had not seen the colonel's insignia folded carefully inside his jacket. They had not read the name printed across his military identification. They had only seen his skin. Officer Luke Barrett moved behind Adrian, one hand gripping his cuffs while the other hovered near his holster. "Expensive car," Barrett muttered, glancing at the polished black sedan. "Military plates too. Who'd you steal it from?" Adrian slowly turned his head. "I told you. The vehicle belongs to me." Mercer laughed beneath the pulsing lights. "Men like you always have an explanation. Men like you." The words settled between them, heavier than the rain. Imagine standing there after spending your life saving strangers, only to realize that none of your medals, sacrifices, or scars could be seen beneath the color of your face. Adrian had heard those words in different forms before. In restaurants. In stores. At security gates where his uniform had earned salutes one moment and suspicion the next. But tonight felt different. There was something reckless in Mercer's eyes. Something hungry. Adrian glanced toward the dashboard of his car, where a small green indicator continued blinking beside the rearview mirror. The officers assumed it was part of the alarm system. It was not. The encrypted camera had activated the moment Mercer pulled him over. Every command, every insult, and every movement was being transmitted to Fort Grayson's Emergency Operations Center. Someone was already watching. "I am going to reach into my jacket," Adrian said slowly. "My military identification is inside the left pocket." Mercer stepped closer. "Don't move. You asked for identification." "I said don't move." Adrian froze. For several seconds, the only sound was the rain tapping against the roof of the sedan and the faint hiss of Mercer's radio. Then a distant crash echoed from beyond the trees. Adrian's eyes shifted toward the darkness. A vehicle had left the road 50 yards away. Through the rain, he could see a shattered windshield and the silhouette of someone slumped behind the wheel. His instincts took over. "There's an injured driver," Adrian said. "I'm a trauma surgeon. Let me help." Barrett looked toward the wreckage, uncertainty crossing his face. Mercer did not move. "You're not going anywhere. That person may be bleeding internally." I said stay down. Adrian took one careful step toward the medical kit resting inside his open car. Mercer raised the gun. "Stop." Adrian stopped immediately, hands visible. "The red case contains emergency surgical equipment," he said. "Every second matters." But Mercer was no longer listening. Fear had mixed with prejudice, and together they created something far more dangerous than anger. Adrian reached only far enough to point toward the kit. The gunshot tore through the rain. His body jerked backward. For one suspended moment, Colonel Adrian Cole remained standing, disbelief flickering across his face. Then blood spread beneath his hand, and he collapsed beside the road he had spent his entire career serving. The green light inside the sedan continued blinking. At Fort Grayson, an alarm began to scream. For 1 second, nobody moved. Officer Luke Barrett stared at Adrian's body as if the rain might erase what had just happened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Mercer still held the gun with both hands, his arms rigid, his face drained of color. He reached for something, Mercer said. Adrian lay on the pavement, one hand pressed against the wound beneath his ribs. His breathing came shallow and controlled. Even in pain, he was measuring the damage. Entry wound. Right side. Possible liver involvement. He had treated men with worse injuries. He had also watched men die from less. The medical kit, Adrian whispered. Barrett stepped toward him. Mercer snapped his head around. Don't touch him. He's bleeding out. He made a move. He pointed at a bag, Ryan. Mercer's jaw tightened. Then that's what goes in the report. The words were quiet, but Adrian heard them. So did the camera. Inside Fort Grayson's Emergency Operations Center, Captain Naomi Price leaned toward the live monitor, her face frozen in disbelief. The feed had arrived under Adrian's protected military channel, automatically flagged when the weapon discharged. Confirm identity, she ordered. A technician typed rapidly. The answer appeared on the central screen. Colonel Adrian Cole. Chief Trauma Surgeon. Priority medical asset. Naomi's expression changed. Alert General Grant. Lock the recording. Notify military police and federal command. Back on the highway, Mercer crouched beside Adrian, not to help him, but to search him. He pulled the wallet from Adrian's jacket and opened it beneath the flashing lights. The military identification was the first thing he saw. Mercer stopped breathing. Barrett looked over his shoulder. The photograph matched. The rank was unmistakable. Colonel. Mercer quickly closed the wallet. We never saw this before the shooting, he said. Barrett stared at him. What? You heard me. In the distance, the injured driver groaned from the wrecked vehicle. Adrian forced his eyes open. You still have time, he said weakly. Get the red case. Neither officer moved. Mercer was no longer thinking about the dying driver. He was thinking about body cameras, statements, supervisors, and how fast one bullet could destroy a 17-year career. Then the radio on his shoulder crackled. All units, stand down and secure the scene. Military command is inbound. Mercer looked toward Adrian's sedan. The small green light near the mirror continued blinking. And for the first time that night, he understood that the man on the ground had never been alone. Long before that night, Colonel Adrian Cole had learned that authority did not always announce itself with noise. Sometimes it entered a room quietly. Sometimes it wore tired eyes, steady hands, and a blood-stained surgical gown. At 43, Adrian had spent more than half his life inside military hospitals, treating injuries most civilians could barely imagine. He had operated beneath collapsing canvas tents in desert storms. He had worked through power failures while artillery shook the walls. He had once kept a young soldier alive for 11 hours with only 2 nurses, a failing generator, and the refusal to surrender. That soldier had been the son of Major General Eleanor Grant. But Adrian never spoke about it. To him, saving a life was not a favor. It was a duty. He had grown up in a narrow brick house outside Baltimore, where his mother worked night shifts and his father taught him that dignity was something no one could hand you, and no one had the right to take away. Never confuse a uniform with character, his father used to say. One is worn on the body. The other is revealed under pressure. Adrian carried those words everywhere. They followed him through medical school, through military training, and through every room where someone looked past his credentials and saw only a black man they believed did not belong. He had been questioned outside his own hospital. Stopped while driving onto his own base. Once, while wearing full-dress uniform, a stranger had asked whether he was part of the cleaning staff. Each time, Adrian had chosen restraint. Not weakness. Restraint. That was why he had remained calm when Mercer ordered him from the car. Why he had explained every movement. Why he had kept his hands visible even while rain ran into his eyes and suspicion hardened the officers' faces. He understood danger. He simply had not expected it from the men wearing badges. Now, as his blood mixed with rainwater on the highway, memories came in broken flashes, his mother's tired smile, the operating room lights, the soldier whose heart had restarted beneath his hands only hours earlier. Then came another sound. Rotors. Faint at first. Growing louder. Barrett looked toward the sky as a black military helicopter emerged through the storm clouds, its searchlight cutting across the trees. Mercer stepped backward. Adrian opened his eyes just enough to see the beam settle over him. And somewhere beneath the pain, he understood. The truth had arrived. The helicopter descended with such force that rainwater exploded from the highway in silver sheets. Officer Mercer raised one arm against the wind, his other hand still wrapped around the pistol. Barrett stood several feet away, staring at Adrian's military identification as though the card had become evidence against them both. The aircraft touched down beyond the wrecked vehicle. Its side door opened before the rotors slowed. Four military police officers stepped into the rain, followed by Major General Eleanor Grant. She wore no raincoat. No hesitation. Only a dark service uniform and an expression so controlled it frightened Mercer more than anger ever could. "Lower your weapon," she ordered. Mercer looked around, confused by how quickly the road had changed. Minutes earlier, he had owned the scene. His badge had controlled every voice, every movement, every version of the truth. Now no one was looking at his badge. "I'm the responding officer," he said. The suspect made a threatening movement. General Grant walked past him without answering. She knelt beside Adrian. For the first time, the hardness in her face cracked. "Colonel Cole." Adrian's eyelids moved. "General," he whispered. "You're going to stay with me." He tried to point toward the wrecked car. "Driver first." Even while bleeding on the pavement, he was still thinking like a surgeon. General Grant turned sharply. "Medical team, 2 patients. Move." Army medics rushed forward, one group surrounding Adrian while another pulled the red trauma case from his sedan and ran toward the injured driver. Mercer stepped closer. He ignored commands. A military police captain blocked his path. "Stay where you are. This is civilian jurisdiction." "Not anymore." The words landed quietly. That made them heavier. Barrett lowered his head. "General, there's something you should know." Mercer's eyes snapped toward him. "Luke." Barrett swallowed. Colonel Cole identified himself. "He told us the bag contained medical equipment." "That's not what happened," Mercer said. Barrett looked at Adrian, then at the blinking camera inside the sedan. He was trying to save someone. Silence spread across the highway. General Grant rose slowly. Her son had once lain on an operating table with almost no chance of surviving. Adrian Cole had refused to give up on him when every monitor said hope was gone. Now Adrian was being lifted onto a stretcher because 2 officers had refused to see the humanity standing in front of them. Grant faced Mercer. "Your body cameras." Mercer said nothing. The military captain checked both officers. "Disabled." Grant's gaze moved toward Adrian's vehicle. But his wasn't. The green indicator blinked again. Every insult had been recorded. Every command. Every lie. And while Mercer watched the stretcher disappear into the helicopter, he finally realized the investigation had already begun before he invented his first excuse. By the time the helicopter disappeared into the storm, Mercer had already begun rewriting the night in his mind. The suspect resisted. The suspect reached for an unknown object. The suspect ignored lawful commands. Each sentence sounded cleaner than the truth. Each sentence placed the blame exactly where Mercer needed it to be. He repeated them silently while military police sealed the highway and photographed the blood on the pavement. He repeated them while Barrett stood apart beneath the flashing lights, soaked, pale, and unable to look at him. "Remember what happened," Mercer said quietly. Barrett did not answer. Mercer moved closer. He made a sudden movement. "We feared for our lives. You were there." Barrett stared toward the wrecked car, where Army medics were stabilizing the injured driver with equipment from Adrian's red case. The man Adrian had tried to save was still alive. That fact made everything worse. "He told us exactly what he was doing," Barrett said. Mercer's face hardened. "Then choose your next words carefully." Inside Fort Grayson, the recording had already been copied to 3 secure servers. Captain Naomi Price watched the footage again. Adrian standing in the rain. His hands raised. His voice calm. Mercer's insults. The warning. The shot. Then the lie. Naomi had reviewed combat footage before. She had seen explosions, ambushes, and soldiers making impossible decisions in seconds. This was different. There had been no battlefield confusion. No hidden enemy. No chaos. Only a black man explaining himself to 2 officers who had decided his truth was impossible. Major General Grant entered the operations room 20 minutes later. Her uniform was still wet. Adrian's blood marked one sleeve. No one spoke as she approached the screen. "Play it from the beginning." Naomi hesitated. "General, you should know the feed is clear." "Play it." The room filled with Mercer's voice. "Expensive car. Who did you steal it from?" "Men like you." Grant watched without moving. But when the gunshot sounded, her hand tightened against the edge of the table. "Colonel Cole's condition?" she asked. "Critical but stable. The bullet missed the heart and major artery, but there is significant internal bleeding." "And the civilian driver?" "Alive because Cole identified the emergency before he was shot." Grant looked back at the frozen image of Adrian on the ground. A man bleeding. Still trying to save someone else. "Send the full recording to Army Criminal Investigation, the Department of Justice, and the State Attorney General," she said. Naomi nodded. Grant's voice lowered. "And suspend every local access agreement tied to those officers until the investigation is complete." At the highway, Mercer's radio crackled again. "Officer Mercer, surrender your weapon." He looked up. This time, no one was asking. Mercer did not surrender his weapon immediately. His fingers tightened around the grip as 3 military police officers approached through the rain. For 17 years, that pistol had made people obey him. It had ended arguments before they began. It had turned suspicion into authority and fear into silence. Now it felt heavier than steel. "Place it on the ground," the captain ordered. Mercer looked toward Barrett, searching for loyalty. He found none. Barrett stood with his hands visible, his face hollow beneath the patrol lights. He had spent years following Mercer's lead, laughing at comments he should have challenged and ignoring complaints he should have reported. But a man had been shot. A camera had seen everything. And silence was no longer protection. Mercer slowly lowered the pistol onto the wet pavement. The captain kicked it away. "You are being temporarily detained pending a joint federal and military investigation." "You can't arrest me," Mercer snapped. "The Army has no authority over a city officer." A second convoy arrived before anyone answered. Black government vehicles stopped along the highway. Federal agents emerged, followed by Ashford Police Chief Thomas Keller, whose face carried the dread of a man realizing the scandal had already grown beyond his control. "Ryan," Keller said, "do exactly what they tell you." Mercer stared at him. "Chief, I followed procedure." Keller looked toward the blood on the road. No procedure authorized this. At Fort Grayson Medical Center, Adrian was rushed beneath white surgical lights. Monitors screamed as doctors cut through his soaked shirt and assessed the damage. Pressure dropping. Possible hepatic injury. Prepare for emergency surgery. Major General Grant watched through the observation glass, unable to ignore the cruel reversal. The surgeon who had saved her son was now fighting for his own life. Outside the operating room, Captain Naomi Price handed her a tablet. We found more. The footage from Adrian's vehicle had triggered a review of Mercer's history. Complaints surfaced almost immediately: illegal searches, racial slurs, disabled cameras, reports that contradicted witness statements. 12 cases. Then 21. Most had been dismissed internally. Grant scrolled through the names. Black drivers. Black teenagers. A black veteran detained outside his own home. This wasn't one bad decision, Naomi said. Grant's eyes remained on the screen. No, she replied. It was a pattern protected by a uniform. Back on the highway. Federal agents placed Mercer in handcuffs. The metal clicked around his wrists. For years, he had believed that sound belonged to people beneath him. Now it announced the collapse of everything he thought his badge could hide. The truth did not arrive with shouting. It arrived in files. 12 years of complaints. Missing footage. Altered reports. Witness statements rewritten until fear looked like guilt and prejudice looked like procedure. By sunrise, federal investigators had taken control of the Ashford Police Department's internal archive. What they found was larger than one shooting and darker than one officer. Mercer had not acted alone. Supervisors had signed his reports without review. Internal affairs investigators had closed complaints within days. Prosecutors had accepted arrests built on contradictions because questioning the badge was more difficult than questioning the accused. And Barrett knew more than he had admitted. Inside a federal interview room, he sat beneath a white light with both hands trembling around a paper cup. Officer Mercer told you to change your statement, the investigator said. Barrett stared at the table. Yes. How many times before tonight? Silence. The question cut deeper than any accusation. Barrett remembered traffic stops where Mercer had planted suspicion before searching a vehicle. He remembered teenagers forced against walls, mothers begging for explanations, veterans showing identification that Mercer refused to read. He had told himself he was keeping the peace. In truth, he had been protecting the man disturbing it. More than once, Barrett whispered. At Fort Grayson Medical Center, the operating room doors finally opened. Major General Grant stood immediately. The surgeon removed his mask. Colonel Cole survived. Grant released a breath she had been holding for hours. The bullet damaged part of his liver, but we controlled the bleeding. He remains critical. Through the glass, Adrian lay surrounded by machines, his face pale beneath the soft hospital lights. He had survived war zones. Now he had survived a roadside encounter in the country he served. The irony spread across the nation before noon. The military recording was released under federal authorization, and millions watched Mercer order Adrian to the ground, mock his identity, ignore an injured civilian, and fire after receiving a clear explanation. There was no violent struggle. No hidden weapon. No confusion. Only a lie exposed frame by frame. That afternoon, Police Chief Keller entered the department briefing room, where Mercer and Barrett stood without badges. Keller placed 2 termination documents on the table. Effective immediately, your employment is over. Mercer stared at the paper. Before a trial? Keller's expression remained cold. This department gave you authority. It never gave you ownership of the truth. Federal agents stepped forward. Mercer's career ended in less time than it had taken Adrian to fall. But the reckoning was not finished. Because losing a badge was only the beginning. Now every case Mercer had touched was being reopened, and every person the system had silenced was about to be heard. Mercer's termination did not save him from what came next. 3 days after the shooting, he entered a federal courtroom without the badge that had once opened doors, ended arguments, and made frightened people lower their eyes. Now he wore gray detention clothes. His hands were cuffed. And no one moved aside for him. The charges were read slowly: aggravated assault, obstruction of justice, falsification of official records, conspiracy, and civil rights violations under color of law. Each word stripped away another piece of the authority he had abused. Luke Barrett entered separately. He had agreed to cooperate, but cooperation did not erase complicity. His testimony exposed years of hidden misconduct, including supervisors who had protected Mercer and officers who had learned that silence was safer than integrity. By the end of the week, 4 commanders were suspended. 2 internal investigators resigned. Dozens of convictions connected to Mercer's reports were placed under review. Families who had been ignored for years received calls they never expected. Their cases were reopening. Their voices mattered again. At Fort Grayson, Adrian woke beneath the quiet rhythm of hospital monitors. Major General Grant sat beside his bed, still wearing the same expression of controlled strength she had carried on the highway. "You nearly died trying to save a stranger," she said. Adrian's voice was weak. "Did he survive?" Grant nodded. "Because you saw him when no one else did." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment. That answer seemed to matter more than the arrests, the headlines, or the careers collapsing across Ashford. When he was strong enough to speak publicly, reporters gathered outside the military hospital. They expected anger. They expected a demand for revenge. Adrian gave them neither. "What happened to me was not caused by one bullet," he said. "It was caused by every ignored complaint, every disabled camera, and every person who chose comfort over truth." The crowd fell silent. He did not ask for Mercer to suffer. He asked for the system to change. Under pressure from the Army and the Department of Justice, Ashford adopted mandatory body camera audits, independent misconduct reviews, racial bias intervention training, and automatic federal notification when officers used force against military personnel. Months later, Mercer was convicted. Barrett lost his badge and received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Adrian returned to surgery with a scar beneath his ribs and steadier hands than before. He had been shot by men who believed power meant never being questioned. But power had finally answered to truth. Mercer thought the badge made him untouchable. Adrian proved that no uniform stands above justice. 1 year later, Colonel Adrian Cole stood beneath the lights of Fort Grayson's main auditorium, facing hundreds of soldiers, doctors, officers, and families whose lives had been changed by a single night on a rain-soaked highway. The scar beneath his uniform still tightened when he breathed too deeply. But he was standing. That mattered. Behind him, a large screen displayed no image of Mercer, no footage of the shooting, and no photograph of Adrian lying in the rain. Instead, it showed the names of 27 people whose complaints had once been dismissed. Drivers. Teenagers. Veterans. Parents. People who had spoken the truth before anyone was ready to hear it. Adrian turned toward the screen. "This was never only my story," he said. His voice was calm, but the room leaned toward every word. "I survived because a camera was recording, because help arrived, and because my position made powerful people listen. Many others had none of those protections." In the front row, Major General Eleanor Grant lowered her eyes. The Army had honored Adrian for courage, but he had refused to accept the medal unless the ceremony included the families harmed by the system that protected Mercer. One by one, they had entered the auditorium. Not as statistics. Not as case numbers. As witnesses. Adrian looked at them before continuing. "A uniform can represent service. A badge can represent trust. But neither one creates character." Silence settled across the hall. Character is revealed when no one important appears to be watching. Outside Fort Grayson, Ashford was changing slowly. New officers wore cameras that could not be disabled without immediate review. Civilian investigators examined force complaints. Recruits studied Adrian's case, not as a public relations lesson, but as a warning about what prejudice could become when armed with authority. The reforms were imperfect. Justice often was. It could not return the lost years, erase the fear, or remove the memory of a gunshot cutting through the rain. But it could prevent silence from becoming policy again. After the ceremony, Adrian returned to the military hospital. A young soldier waited in the operating room, frightened and barely conscious. Adrian washed his hands, put on his surgical gown, and stepped beneath the familiar white lights. His hands were steady. The bullet had not taken that from him. Mercer once believed power meant controlling who stood, who knelt, and who was allowed to speak. Adrian learned something greater. Real power heals what hatred tries to destroy. He wore no badge. He needed none. Because that day, justice did not arrive carrying a weapon. It arrived with steady hands, an open truth, and a black man who refused to let injustice have the final word.